The prevailing image of nuclear escalation is a strategic relic. It involves missile silos, bomber scrambles, and elaborate defense systems debated by physicists for decades. This is a 20th century blueprint for a 21st century conflict. The kinetic cost is immense, the attribution is absolute, and the strategic utility is questionable. The primary vector for strategic risk is no longer the missile. It is the silence that precedes it. The true battle space is the nervous system of Western capital and military power, the subsea data cables, and the orbital satellite constellations. A years-long campaign targeting core infrastructure, such as AWS, is not an isolated event. It is a reconnaissance in force. Analysts at RUSI document that the objective is not destruction, but control and denial. The goal is to achieve strategic paralysis with perfect deniability, to sever the optic nerves. This creates the blind Leviathan scenario. A superpower, stripped of its satellite intelligence, its GPS-guided munitions rendered inert, and its high-frequency trading frozen, does not simply wait for the lights to come back on. It is a wounded, cornered animal. All standard operating procedures become void. The command and control apparatus is decapitated, leaving only the reflexive protocols. Here, systemic financial weakness becomes the accelerant. A nation facing a solvency crisis, with its national debt at levels described as a red line by Treasury officials, cannot absorb the systemic shock of an economic and communications blackout. It lacks the financial resilience to wait, to rebuild, or to wage a prolonged conventional response. A state that cannot see and cannot pay is left with only one lever of power, a hair trigger, launch on warning posture, creating a direct vector from a silent, asymmetric attack to kinetic, strategic escalation. Adversary action is not driven by strength, but by a systemic solvency crisis. According to analysis from strategic groups like CSIS, unpopular military campaigns function as a domestic liability, creating a fiscal black hole. The kinetic cost of conventional warfare becomes unsustainable. A state hemorrhaging capital must export this crisis or collapse internally. This is not ideology. It is a mathematical function of state survival. When symmetric engagement is fiscally impossible, the strategic protocol pivots to asymmetry. The objective shifts from battlefield victory to inflicting a crippling economic shock on the adversary at the lowest possible cost. We have direct evidence of this pivot. Reports confirm a years-long Russian cyber campaign targeting core U.S. infrastructure, specifically AWS cloud services. This is not random aggression. It is a calculated, low-cost investment designed to yield catastrophic failure in the U.S. economic engine. This is the blueprint of modern conflict. A nation facing its own solvency event is incentivized to trigger one in its rival. Unable to afford more tanks, it invests in code. Unable to win a war of attrition, it seeks to bankrupt the opponent by targeting the very systems underpinnings its financial solvency: the power grid, the cloud, the markets. The motive is to force a liquidity crisis in the United States before its own internal liabilities cause a systemic collapse. It is a zero-sum race to the bottom. The blueprint for systemic collapse is now a matter of public record. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, have quantified the new economics of lethality. The kinetic cost model is inverted. A $5 million main battle tank can now be neutralized by a $500 FPV drone. This is not a battlefield anomaly. It is an economic attack vector. The cost to destroy is now orders of magnitude lower than the cost to build and defend, creating an unsustainable financial liability for any legacy military power. This radical cost asymmetry enables what strategists call the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal strategic-level force has been obliterated by commercial technology. Non-state actors and rival powers can now bypass conventional military defenses entirely. They are incentivized to wage economic warfare through asymmetric means. Years-long Russian cyberattack campaigns targeting core infrastructure like AWS are a direct application of this doctrine. The objective is not to win a battle, but to trigger a systemic shock the target cannot financially absorb. This creates the ultimate solvency trap. A nation straining under a $38 trillion national debt, a figure testing long-feared red lines, loses the capacity for conventional response. In the event of a grid-down scenario or a mass liquidity crisis, the U.S. cannot afford a symmetric, asset-for-asset retaliation. The standard deterrence protocol is bypassed. This forces a direct escalation pathway from an economic crisis to a kinetic and potentially strategic response. The math creates a launch-on-warning posture, not by choice, but by economic necessity. The primary theater of operations is not the final battlefield, but the laboratory. Analysts at RUSI identify these areas as gray zones, regions where systemic decay and political instability create a permissive environment for staging attacks. Recent warnings about fragility in nations like South Africa or even Canada are not the root cause. They are symptoms. These regions now function as proxy laboratories, operational staging grounds for the primary assault. Within these gray zones, adversaries field test and deploy asymmetric weapons. The target is not military hardware. It is systemic infrastructure. Reports confirm a years-long Russian campaign targeting core digital platforms like AWS, source number 2. This is the blueprint. Leverage the lawlessness of a failing state to launch deniable, low-cost attacks against high-value economic choke points. The objective is to engineer a systemic shock. This strategy is viable for one reason. U.S. solvency is no longer a given. With national debt metrics crossing a red line, source 1, the system has lost its capacity to absorb shocks. The gray zone is where the match is lit, but the systemic financial weakness is the accelerant. An adversary understands that the kinetic cost of a conventional U.S. response to an attack staged from a proxy is now fiscally prohibitive. This financial liability forces an escalation protocol shift. An asymmetric attack staged from a proxy, if successful in triggering a liquidity crisis, bypasses conventional deterrence. Unable to fund a sustained engagement, the response doctrine is compressed. CSIS analysis confirms this creates a direct vector from a grid-down or market crash event to a launch-on warning posture. The gray zone, therefore, is not a geographic location. It is a mathematical trap designed to make strategic escalation the only solvent response. The nuclear command structure is not built for a world of insolvent superpowers. It was designed for a Cold War binary, based on a doctrine known as launch-on-warning. The protocol is a mathematical response to a decapitation strike. If early warning systems detect an inbound strategic launch, you must launch your own arsenal before impact. The logic is zero-sum. Use your assets or lose them entirely. This entire framework depends on one thing: trusted data. That trust is now the primary target. We are in a state of undeclared digital warfare. According to CRN magazine, Russian state-sponsored actors have been engaged in a years-long campaign targeting core AWS infrastructure. Analysts at RUSI confirm that military command, control, and communications (C3) systems are increasingly reliant on this same commercial cloud architecture. This is not a theoretical vulnerability. It is an active theater of operations. This creates the fog of digital war. Consider the NORAD commander's perspective. The early warning radar and satellite feeds suddenly go dark. Is this a system failure or a deliberate blinding attack preceding a full-scale launch? The protocol offers no room for ambiguity. The commander has minutes to decide. Waiting for confirmation risks total annihilation. Launching risks global thermonuclear war based on a ghost in the machine. In this scenario, fear becomes the trigger. The doctrine forces the commander to assume the worst-case scenario, that the digital blindness is the first shot in a nuclear war. The kinetic cost of miscalculation is absolute. An adversary, understanding the U.S. is too financially fragile to absorb a nationwide grid-down event, can now leverage a cyber attack to force a strategic response. They don't have to launch a missile, they only have to make you believe they did. The core protocol of strategic deterrence is breaking down. It is no longer a function of kinetic capability, but of economic solvency. As U.S. sovereign debt approaches a $38 trillion threshold Janet Yellen acknowledges as a red line, the system loses its capacity to absorb asymmetric shocks. This creates a direct vector for adversaries engaged in what CRN magazine documents as years-long cyber campaigns against critical infrastructure, such as AWS. An adversary's primary objective is no longer to defeat the U.S. military, but to trigger a systemic liquidity crisis. The next phase is not invasion, it is calibration. A calculated, deniable strike designed to test the fragility of the U.S. financial system and the speed of its response protocol under duress. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a cascading, attribution-impossible blackout targeting the Port of Long Beach's data and logistics network. The event will be publicly categorized as a catastrophic system failure. The actual purpose is to measure the precise kinetic and economic cost required to sever a primary U.S. supply artery, providing a blueprint for a wider, systemic attack when U.S. solvency is at its weakest point. This is the calibration shot.